Ja, guten Abend, meine Damen und Herren. Herzlich willkommen zum zweiten Vortrag in der Ringvorlesungsreihe Die Folgen des Krieges in der Ukraine. Ich freue mich sehr, dass Sie wieder so zahlreich erschienen sind. Sie haben es vielleicht auf der Internetseite der Universität gesehen oder im Eingang unten auch wahrgenommen. Es gibt eine Programmänderung. Georg von Nolken sollte heute vortragen. Er hat sich Sonntag bei mir gemeldet. Er muss leider krankheitsbedingt absagen. An dieser Stelle, Georg, falls er das Video anschaut, beste Genesungswünsche. Wie Sie sich vielleicht vorstellen können, Herr von Nolkens Meldung hat mich natürlich Sonntag ein bisschen in Panik versetzt. Zunächst dachte ich, dass wir die heutige Veranstaltung vielleicht gänzlich würden absagen müssen. Dann fiel mir eine mögliche Rettung ein und nach einigen E-Mails und Telefonate kristallisierte sich diese als tatsächliche Rettung aus. Wir haben das ganz große Glück im Unglück, dass Oleg Nivievskyi, ein in Göttingen promovierter ukrainischer Agrarökonom und Professor an der Kyiv School of Economics, sich bereit erklärt hat, kurzfristig einzuspringen und heute Abend einen Vortrag zu halten. Sie können sich bestimmt gut vorstellen, wie erleichtert und dankbar ich war, als Oleg auf meine Panikrufe Sonntag schnell geantwortet und zugesagt hat. Oleg wird auf Englisch vortragen und bevor ich selbst ins Englische wechsle und Oleg etwas ausführlicher vorstelle, möchte ich eine Bitte an Sie, meine Damen und Herren, herantragen. Da kurzfristige Absagen gerade in dieser Zeit leider nicht auszuschließen sind und da es bestimmt nicht immer gelingen wird oder gelingen kann, einen so geeigneten Ersatz kurzfristig zu organisieren, rufen Sie doch bitte immer Montag, Dienstag die Internetseite der Universität und der Ringvorlesung auf, damit Sie eventuelle Programmänderungen und was ich nicht hoffe, aber was nicht auszuschließen ist, Absagen rechtzeitig, damit Sie die rechtzeitig mitbekommen. So, ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure to welcome today's presenter, Dr. Oleg Nivievskyi, Assistant Professor and Vice President for Economics Education at the Kyiv School of Economics. Oleg earned a first degree in physics from the National Kamyanets-Podilsky University in Ukraine in 2001. He then completed a master's degree in economics at the Kyiv School of Economics in 2004, and it was during this time that he came to my attention because he was a research assistant in the project that I was involved in Kyiv at the time. I was thrilled when Oleg agreed to come to Göttingen as a PhD student in my group. He spent several very productive years here working with me and with other people in my chair. And in 2010, he defended his PhD thesis, which is composed of 6 papers on the competitiveness, efficiency, and productivity of large farms in Ukraine and Belarus. After completing his PhD, Oleg returned to Kyiv as a researcher and as a consultant. He has contributed to several major agricultural reforms in Ukraine, including a comprehensive land market reform and the opening of the agricultural land market under a joint World Bank EU program entitled Supporting Transparent Land Governance in Ukraine. Ukraine is underrepresented in European and international agricultural economics. A country that is so important, that has so much weight in global agriculture, should have a commensurate, much larger weight and voice in the academic and research community than is currently the case. If you go to the big international conferences, there aren't many Ukrainian scientists who attend. And if you look at the journals, there aren't very many Ukrainian agricultural economists who publish. Oleg is an exception. He's a ray of hope for the future, a young, internationally active and recognized agricultural economist. Oleg, your presentation is titled The Effects of Russia's Invasion on Ukraine's Agriculture and Implications for Global Food Security. Thank you very much for agreeing to jump in at such short notice. I'm looking forward to your presentation and to the discussion afterwards. The floor is yours.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm from Ukraine, from Kyiv. I'm a visiting researcher at the moment at Stefan's chair at the University of Göttingen, and it's really indeed difficult to talk to you about Ukrainian agriculture and Ukraine overall, because just 2 hours ago, Ukraine was bombarded by about 100 missiles from Russia. 70 of them were taken down by the anti-missiles system, but the others reached their targets, and you might have heard that about 80% of Lviv, this is the city at the border, is now without energy, and half of Kyiv is also without energy. So it's always kind of emotionally difficult to have such a speech. But nevertheless, I'm really happy to be here and to share the view that we as a researcher have on this war, and to share the numbers and analytical things that we developed since the very first day of the war, and what's happening actually on Ukraine, and how does it ripple across the world, not just kind of in Ukraine, but across the world. So I'd like to make a couple of points today, and I'd like to develop them by the end of the presentation. Is first that Russia is trying to basically negate Ukraine with all these missiles, and tries to ruin basically Ukraine. It's difficult to be unbiased in this kind of talk, because it's for me it's easier to take a side in this kind of situation, but I'll try to be as unbiased as possible and try to show the real picture, not kind of what I feel inside. And I will show you the immense toll already Ukraine is suffering already in terms of damages, losses, human lives. And then I will show you through the agricultural link, how does it affect the world. And we'll try to, and I will show you that although this is really a local thing happening on European territory, it has really a global effect across the world, and substantial global effect. And I will try to also kind of discuss a little bit on my expectation, knowing what is happening in Ukraine and how can it affect the rest of the world. So, yeah, I can run it. So the presentation will be structured along a couple of things. First, I will show you how Ukrainian agriculture was placed in the economy of Ukraine, then how it reached to the level that it is now. Then I will talk about the damages and losses currently Ukraine is suffering in totally, and in agriculture specifically, outlook a little bit on Ukrainian agriculture, take into account the damages and losses we are currently suffering, and implications for the global food security. So Ukraine overall is endowed with really, well, probably not perfect, but above average agri-climatic conditions. So in terms of soils, you see on the map a couple of places across in the map in green, where with really high quality of land. It's kind of a composite measurement, but it shows you where the most fertile, where's the most fertile land in the world. So it's kind of in the United States, in the Corn Belt. Then you have the place in the Argentina, Rio de la Plata, and you have a spot which is completely covered in green, and this is Ukraine. A little bit of Russia, a little bit of other countries, neighbors, but it's basically Ukraine. And this is a good background to have really a vibrant and competitive agricultural sector in Ukraine. Also, location is quite favorable because we have access to the Black Sea. There are countries around us that need our food, that are not able to grow their own food in a sufficient amounts. This is Northern Africa, Middle East. So it's quite a good, and also European Union requiring feed from Ukraine. That's a good kind of condition to have a vibrant, competitive agriculture. And it's not just a good quality land; it's also a mass of a land, because more than 70% of Ukrainian territory is agricultural land. It's so disproportionately more land available for agriculture than probably in other countries in Europe. And in terms of the arable land, we have more land than France, Germany has. So it's also a good background and for agriculture. The role of Ukraine domestically and globally quite substantial. Domestically, Ukrainian agriculture is mainly about crop production. There was a substantial restructuring of agriculture since the breakup of the Soviet Union, but in the end, now we see that about 75% of Ukrainian agriculture is basically crop production. Majority of this crop is grain, oilseeds, which we export because we don't need that much of a crop. So if we take into account upstream and downstream sectors, so that means agricultural input supplies and food processing, altogether this is about 20% of Ukrainian economy. So fifths of our economy is generated by agriculture, basically. And also, before the war, more than 40% of our export revenues were coming from exporting agri-food products. So quite substantial sector for economy overall. And globally, Ukraine has been also emerging in a substantial global player. So if we convert all the grains and oilseeds that we exported last year, for instance, we came up with the figures that our export, in a sense, feed more than 400 million people across the world. This is on top of the Ukrainian population. So, and there is still a gap to be covered in terms of productivity, and I will talk about it about it later. Where our wheat and corn goes, these are basically countries in Africa region, Northern Africa and the Middle East. Some of the countries that exported before the war wheat from Ukraine depended a lot on products from Ukraine. So the level of dependence was more than, in some cases, more than 50%. Of course, you see Russia on the slide. I mean, we cannot ignore this country because they also quite substantial exporters of wheat. And what they're doing right now is also will have an effect on the supplies of agri-food products from our region, at least. It took a long way to get there, to the emerging global player, agricultural player. I mean, from the breakup of the Soviet Union, the agriculture was basically in ruins, I would say. So the productivity was quite low, and we needed lots of investment. But as time, but step by step, productivity increased in Ukraine. Restructuring took place, and more efficient former businesses stayed in the sector. In the Soviet times, we had lots of livestock production going on. Now we don't have that much because the crop sector basically squeezed livestock from the sector, but that wasn't just just a competition. There were lots of factors behind this. There was problems with the access to capital. There was a problem with lack of land market, lack of talents, lack of knowledges, and that all brought us to the stage where the agricultural profile in Ukraine, it shrunk to basically grains, oilseeds, poultry. That's also what we export a lot, and basically that's it. So quite really specifically, but quite competitiveness-driven sector. So basically, our farmers, they just were seeking where the maximum profits are, and they basically changed their structures towards the most favorable or most marginally profitable crops. And you see from the grain, for instance, trend that whatever we produce on top of last year's figures, we exported, okay? So every ton of additional tons that we produce of grain is basically exported because the population of Ukraine is shrinking, especially now, and you know, we don't need that much grain for Ukrainian consumption. And you know, in terms of oil seeds, that's also the case, but we don't export a lot of oil seeds, specifically sunflower seeds. We crush them and export as sunflower oil, and I think about 50% of the global market of sunflower oil is Ukrainian. So this is our share in the global trade in sunflower oil. But that was kind of a promising picture. We expected that we will be growing even higher, even more, because you know, the gap, productivity gap, was still substantial back last year. There were some studies saying that, you know, we can increase we have still productivity gap like 30%, 50%. Some crazy people said that, you know, we could even double. But I mean, there was a substantial productivity gap to be covered, and we thought we could really even increase our production substantially and supply the world with the food that we had. But then the war basically began on February 24th, full scale, because the beginning of the war was in 2014 when Russia annexed Donbas region and Crimea. Then in the very first months of the war, I think about 20% of Ukrainian territory was occupied by Russia, but then our troops were doing hard to retake the territories. You see the territories on the map pictured in gray. This is the territories that were retaken by Ukrainian troops, and quite recently Kherson was liberated. The city in the south, very famous for its horticulture, tomatoes, watermelons, etc. Of course, you know, this kind of full-scale war brought a lot of damages to Ukrainian agriculture. Sorry for the pictures, but this is what we experience every day. So this is the farm that was bombed in the very first day of the war. This is a really huge farm, more than 100 heads of cattle. It was ruined completely. And then these are pictures you also can have in the internet. So damaged tractors and agricultural machinery units doing the field crops, field works. That are blown up on the mines. And you know, some drivers are injured, some not, luckily. But you know, this is the situation that in which our farmers are basically working right now. And this is how the fields in Ukraine look like. With lots of shelling or places from the missiles, from the bombs. And these fields is difficult to cultivate further. It has to be recultivated, right? Because you know, we have to restore the upper layer of the ground so that you could use it afterwards. And these are all damages, and you have plenty of places all over the Ukraine. This picture was taken in summertime, but you know, but that was a couple of months ago, and definitely now you have more of these places in Ukraine. Also, Russia was trying, you know, to burn our harvest because, you know, we had many episodes documenting that was done on purpose. So entire fields were burned by Russians, and this picture was taken by a graduate of our school, by Igor Lutsenko, and you know, he took this picture from his drone that he was driving at the time. Stefan showed this picture last time, but again, this is also a nice picture to show in which conditions our farmers have to, you know, to cultivate and to do their work. So they have to maneuver, and I mean, in the end of the day, that's all costs, right? So you have to produce, you have to do more runs, you have to spend more fuel, you have to be more careful. So, and that that creates a lot of additional cost for Ukrainian agriculture. So taking all this into account, and then what does it mean for Ukrainian agriculture, okay? From the very first day of the war, our school, we were doing lots of analytical exercise. We were putting bit by bit various pieces of information, documents, and then cases which we could really analyze, which we could attach a value to, which we could measure. And we set up various things related to the damages and losses, to estimating the damages and losses in this war, because we thought that this is really important, that what we have to do from the very first day of the war. So we have a portal called Russia Will Pay, that collects all the damages that Ukraine experienced in the course of the war. And I will, before I show you the damages and losses related to agriculture, I will show you the bigger picture, okay? So the overall, because apparently damages related to agriculture, they are smaller than what Ukraine overall is suffering. This is, the valuation and the measurement was done using the standard methodology developed by the World Bank and the European Union, which is called post-disaster needs assessment. So this is the first time that this methodology was used to value war losses and damages, because before that, this methodology was applied to various disasters that were happening across the world. So that was specifically done for disasters, but now it's really related to the war. And this is a complication, because after the disaster, it's basically gone, and you can go and see what happened and attach the value and get the overall value. This is not the case. You have to follow what's been damaged every day, and produce rounds of reviews, and to monitor this thing on a regular basis. But overall, the total damages and losses in Ukraine are already catastrophic, I would say. This table is taken from the World Bank report on damages and losses, where we also contributed to this report and helped our World Bank colleagues to with the data and with some analytical support. But these numbers are all as of June. So if you look at the bottom line of this table, you will see that the damages as of June were around $100 billion already. The losses, economic losses, were more than $250 billion, and the funds, or funds needed to rebuild Ukraine from that condition was already at about $350 billion. That was in June. Just to give you in perspective, $350 billion, this is almost twice Ukrainian GDP in 2021. So Ukrainian GDP was about 200 billion. It's about 10% of the German GDP. Okay, so if you take that into perspective, 10% of the German GDP. So that's quite a lot already, but that was in June. Since then, the picture changed a lot. And also, on this slide is about giving another perspective, that the toll that is already taking place in Ukraine reaches already the figures that we saw in other cases of war happening across the world in the history. Of course, it's far away, luckily, to the World War II damages, which were about $2 trillion in 2021 prices. But it's already reaching to, for instance, it's more than the war in Bosnia or the Korean War, and it's taking the scale is increasing, I would say, in that respect. But that was in June again. Already in September, the level of damages was $127 billion. So almost $30 billion on top okay, of the figures that we had in June. So quite substantial increase. And it's September. After September, we had really a huge episode of shelling, massive shellings in October. Then we had massive shellings today, quite comparable. And our government says that more than 40% of the civil infrastructure has been destroyed. I mean, the energy generation and heat generation infrastructure has been destroyed. So this toll is already outdated, I would say. So that's a bigger picture. The smaller picture is about agriculture. In agriculture, we do this specific exercise also for agriculture. We also, there are links on the slides. You can just see yourself and to familiarize with the reports. But the damages to the physical infrastructure to Ukrainian agriculture are already about $6.6 billion. So this is, if you compare to the sector capital, this is about 23% of the total sector capital. So we can say that more than a fifth of Ukrainian agriculture has been destroyed completely. Okay, so 23% of the Ukrainian agriculture. I mean, you have various chunks attributed to specific damages, individual damages, like you see that the biggest chunk is linked to machinery. Okay, so 44% out of this total damages is attributed to machinery, various pieces of agricultural machinery and equipment. So this is about 85,000 units, various units of agricultural machinery are damaged or partially damaged. Then we have another bigger chunk is stored products, about 2 billion. This is what Russia has stolen from Ukraine or damaged, because we also have seen lots of silos being damaged and, you know, the oil being on the ground. So in total, this is about 3 million tons of grains and 1 million tons of oilseed that were stolen or destroyed. And also the storage capacity have been destroyed quite substantially. In terms of storage capacity, it's about 10 million tons of storage capacity that has been destroyed in Ukraine, and in monetary values, it's more than 1 billion. Okay, so these are the damages. So this is what the capital that was destroyed by various things from shellings or other activities. But that's not the whole picture. Well, this is kind of a geographical distribution. Apparently or naturally, these are the regions where the intensive military fightings were taking place, which are in the northern part of Ukraine, the southern and eastern part of Ukraine. Agricultural losses, this is a bit different to the damages, because losses, these are the losses, economic losses that Ukrainian farmers suffered. So this is, for example, a foregone revenue that Ukrainian farmers didn't get because of the Russian intervention, or yields that they couldn't get because there were not sufficient seed supplies, fuel supply, or other things, or increased costs due to Russian aggression, because fuel was getting more expensive, fertilizers also were getting more expensive. So these are the costs accrued because of the Russia aggression. And you see from this graph that as of September, the losses accrued to Ukrainian agriculture are about $35 billion. To be more specific, $34.5 billion. This is a lot. This is almost 75% of the last year agricultural output. So 75% of last year agricultural output. And the lion's share of these losses is attributed to export disruptions and depressed prices, domestic prices, because although the world market prices were growing up, over the last, well, since the beginning of the Russian aggression. The domestic prices that the farmers received were 50% less than before the war. So, I mean, in this golden time, basically, for the farmers, in really prices going through the roof, our farmers are suffering from losses because of the really depressed prices and because of the substantial, export costs and logistics costs that they experience. Because I think I have it here. Yeah, because what happened basically from the very beginning of the Russian aggression is that they blocked our exports. They blocked Black Sea ports from shipping our grain and oilseeds from Ukraine. And since we were really focused on the ports, on the maritime trade, then this route was basically not available for Ukrainian agriculture and for traders. So the traders and the farmers were forced to find alternative ways to export. And from the very beginning, that wasn't possible. And the other alternative capacities or routes were really limited in terms of capacity. Either this is via the land with trucks or railways, or through the river ports on the Danube River and taking this grain down to Constanța. That was also alternative route for Ukrainian grain. But that was not enough to get all this huge amount of grain out of Ukraine, and that cost a lot because that involves another things in the supply chain. And but because of the grain corridor that exists in Ukraine since that was moderated with Russia, by Turkey, and by UN, the maritime trade is taken up. So since July, and it's taken up in quite substantial amounts. But you see that it flattens. Okay, although now this is a period where you have to really export a lot. This is really export period, high season for exports. But it's flattening. Okay, and this is not kind of it's not a surprise, because we have threats from Putin all the time that this corridor is not sustainable. It brings threat to Russia, and there's always a discussion to undermine the validity and sustainability of this corridor. And our farmers and traders, they are kind of following this. They take into account and trying to shift as much as possible to more secure routes. These are the river, Danube, these are the railway routes, and this is a truck routes. But that was kind of also. So ports were not available at that time, although not available in the capacity that was needed. We had also huge lines of truck waiting to cross the border. So the trucks were waiting a week, 2 weeks of that time to cross the border, and there was a kind of huge story, a scandal, I would say, because there were many factors involved. But ignoring what was behind, that were additional costs, or logistics costs or export costs to the farmers, because the farmers, this is really the person that pays the price of this high logistics cost, because traders, they always roll over the cost on the shoulders of the farmers. So the cost increased by a factor of 6, from about $30 per ton to $200 per ton. And this is why the prices were so much depressed in Ukraine, and this is why farmers are suffering these huge losses, economic losses, because of the Russian invasion. And this is also to give you a perspective in how the cost and damages increased over the time. So in June, in terms of the damages, Ukraine had $4.3 billion of damages. Now in September, not now, but in September, they are Oh, sorry, it's, yeah, and now they are 6.6, but in terms of damages, as also we see kind of increase by 30%. So now, I mean, it's already November, so I guess that the toll is higher by 30%. But again, this is just my assumption. But you know, the trend is quite evident. So, in the summary to the story about agriculture is that from the very first day of the Russian aggression, the exports were stuck. And the alternative routes were not in the capacity that Ukraine needed, were not available to accommodate all this huge amount of grain that and oilseed that Ukraine had. High logistics costs because of this traffic jams, because of the low capacity available for alternative for export alternative routes. The logistics costs increased from $30 to $200 per ton. And the domestic prices depressed substantially. That all creates liquidity problems, because if you talk to the Ukrainian farmers, they all make the calculations. So for them, at least to the farmers that I talk to, I mean, for them it's better to wait until the springtime and see what happened, and decide whether they have to plant anything or not, because what they were telling me that if we didn't do anything since the beginning of the war, we would be in better position now than we are at the moment, because we are really suffering from insecurity. We have products available, but we don't know what to do with this, okay? Because the prices that we get because of the situation are low enough to reap the benefit, to reap the profits. So they are all experiencing substantial losses, liquidity problems, and basically sitting and waiting what to do. I mean, in terms of the evidence of the decision, if you look at the winter crop campaign at the moment, it's about 40–50% of the last year figures. So we will not have more than of winter wheat available than the last year, and this is about 40–50% of the last year winter crops. And in terms of this export route, grain deal, I mean, it's good that it's available, because there are we have this volume of grains available for Ukraine, and we need to get rid of it, because the storages are full, and the new harvest is coming in, and there is a lack of storage capacity. Moreover, Russians are destroying the storage capacities in Ukraine, so it's good that we have this relief of exports from Ukraine. But it's really a problem that it doesn't really benefit farmers a lot, because the prices that they're getting from for these exports are too low to be profitable and to sustain the farming in this season and in the next season. And that's why farmers in Ukraine are very much in a despair, I would say. If you talk to them, they all telling the story that the situation is catastrophic because of the liquidity and because of the lack of the funds, and because of the lack of security in terms of their expectations. Okay. So this is what we can expect next year. So the crop, at least what we have, the story that we have in Ukraine is that the next year we're gonna have like 40% less of crop available, and that means that the rest of the world will also will not get this additional crop that we could have produced. And above all, and on top of that, the macroeconomic situation is worsening. Okay, because we cannot really look at the agriculture isolated from the rest of the economy. So we have a substantial devaluation of the foreign currency, a substantial budget deficit. The war is very much expensive, and the deficit, the monthly deficit is about $5 billion, and there is no enough resources available to compensate for this budget deficit. The commitments from the international donor community we have is not enough to cover this gap, and moreover, the support that we are getting is quite slow. Okay, and hopefully that is going to take up, but still this is the situation that we have right now, and the human toll is immense already. More than 100,000 civilians have been killed and more injured. The combatants, the death toll of combatants is also more than 10,000. 14 million of people left their homes, like me, for instance. 7 million of them are already living in other countries. They are refugees, registered or not registered. So, the outflow of people from Ukraine is immense. I mean, we've never had this experience before, and this is all taking place because that all means less economic activity, less demand, less productive resources, less human productive resources, and that's kind of coming on top, coming on top of what we have in agriculture. And our economy is expected to plummet by 45% this year. So basically, we'll contract by a factor of 2. But again, this is not just about Ukraine. The effect is global, and you feel it here in Germany. You feel it in terms of increased prices, energy prices, that all ripples across the world. And you see the effect that the war had from the very beginning. So we had a trend of increasing food prices, but then war began, and then the price went up, quite substantially. It went down a little bit afterwards, after a couple of months, but still the effect was substantial. And but that means that not just prices for Ukraine, that means that prices for all the people across the world. In every corner of the world, the prices increased substantially, especially in the countries where that are poor. Maybe there are some countries with, Stefan mentioned last time, India and China that looked a little bit isolated from this trend, but still countries in Asia, in Latin America, in Africa, they all suffer. I mean, just look at this figure, just look at this map. So this is snap of food inflation or increase in food prices as of January 2022. So there are spots on the maps with the food price increase, from 10 to 30%. So basically, the color means the intensity or the level of food price increase. But I mean, you see red, not that much. I mean, there are a little bit places where in Africa, Russia, but then after. So that was in January, and now this picture was done for as of August. Okay, so you have more places in the world with the really increasing food inflation and taking 2-digit size, and that means that people have to pay more and more for the food, and this is especially bad or dangerous for the countries in the low-income countries, like in Africa, in the Middle East. Some countries experience 100% increase for food prices. There was a recent report done by the World Bank Commodity Markets Outlook. There is a nice story there about and a nice analysis there about the food price inflation. But I mean, again, this is what we all feel in the world. So Ukrainian story is no longer local; it's really global, and especially in taking into account the disruptions that we experience, the trade disruptions that we experience because of the war aggression. But that means it's not just the suffering that Russia is bringing onto Ukraine. It's not just the lives in Ukraine. These are the lives of many more people across the world, suffering from hunger, from undernourishment. The whole globe was expecting to get the number of undernourished people substantially this year, but this is no longer available. Even the reverse, because of the war, there are various estimates, but the number of people suffering from acute undernourishment or hunger will increase by more than 20 million people across the world. This is on top of what has been, done in Ukraine, and this is really. I'm not telling that this is specifically related to Russia, of course, but still, Russia is a huge factor in this story. So, to conclude my presentation, Ukraine has been emerging before the war as a major agricultural player. We supplied a lot to the global market, agricultural food market, and we were hoping to supply even more because there was a substantial productivity gap available for Ukrainian agriculture. And the exports from Ukraine, they are equivalent to feeding more than 400 million people. If you convert all this grain that is available in Ukraine to feeding that many people. Because of the war, this trend disrupted, and the losses and damages accrued to Ukrainian agriculture are huge, catastrophic, I would say, and that's also on top or in the background of the worsening macroeconomic situation, and but that means that farmers in Ukraine, they experience substantial liquidity problems. They are not able to cover the cost of their production. They experience significant liquidity problems. They are not planting at the scale that was available last year, so about 40–50% of the last year figures. And because of that, the outlook for the next year is is not optimistic, at least. Okay, so no doubt there's going to be less food available from Ukraine. There are figures about 40–50%, but that means that the world will not get that food from Ukraine, the grain from Ukraine. And this is really bad because what we see from the global perspective, from the global food security perspective, is that the agricultural outlook for the next year is not that also optimistic because of the droughts occurring across the world, because of the disrupted supply chains, because of the disrupted, because the market integration doesn't work well at the moment. That means that every ton of grain that is missing from Ukraine will count in terms of lives, in terms of lives, basically, of people across the world. So the threat will increase, and this threat comes from Russia, I would say, and hopefully that this madness will finish soon, because we are all depend from it, and we all feel bad from this war. Thank you very much.
Is that better? Yep. Oh, okay, great, thanks. Thank you very much for that presentation, Oleg. I'm sure it was not easy for you to stay calm and be as factual as you were throughout. given what's happening to your country and to your countrymen and countrywomen at home. I'll start with one question, and then the floor is open, and I'll go around and hand out the microphone to anyone who would like to contribute. You talked about the destruction to the physical plant, and you talked about revenue losses, but I was going to ask about the farmers themselves. Who's doing the farming with so many displaced people within the country? And I imagine that a lot of young men are in the military, for example. Is there a labor shortage as well? Or what is, how can I imagine it in agriculture at the moment in Ukraine?
Yeah, it's a good question. Not sure whether I can answer it completely, but in terms of the labor, there was a shortage of labor already available before the war. There were not many people willing to go to agriculture and to work in agriculture, and of course, because of the war, this problem only increased. But to what scale it did increase, I don't know. Difficult to say. Yeah, I don't have these figures.
It's related to what I mentioned before about the fact that Ukrainian agricultural sciences is too small. Yeah. Basically, given the importance of agriculture in the country, because the whole education and research system is not in very good shape.
Oh, it's in terrible shape. I can be really blunt about that.
And not many young Ukrainians want to study agriculture, for example, and so on, and this makes it only worse. So, questions? Who would like to ask a question?
Yes, Doctor, thank you for your nice presentation. You have presented many interesting figures here. One figure which I like to relate is, what was your GDP before the Russian war broke out? Just to get this a little bit in a relationship.
200 billion last year. Yeah, it's not big.
That gives us indication about, you said before, in June,
yep.
10% from the German, which
right.
3.5 trillions.
Yeah, exactly. So
before the war, you had only 250.
200 billion.
200 billion.
200 billion, yeah.
Yeah, that gives you.
And the needs that were assessed in the last World Bank report are already twice as high as Ukrainian GDP.
Thank you.
Any other questions? You mentioned today, Oleg, that there have been these missile attacks. Again, today, a very heavy attack. Is there any news on the grain corridor on the Black Sea route? Because officially, it will expire on November 19th, which is very soon. And so the question is there any sign that it's going to be renewed?
What can I hear from the news is that the discussions are going on. And at least from the Turkish side, and Zelensky, the President Zelensky, yesterday or the day before, announced that he also pushing for the grain corridor, but without a kind of a deadline, without the actual termination. It should be without any terms specified. But how far these discussions are, I don't have information.
Far as I know, there are some foreign investors investing in agriculture and Ukraine. Do you know anything about those investors now withdrawing from Ukraine after the beginning of the war? And if so, what are your expectations on the situation?
Yeah, so the situation with the foreign direct investment wasn't really splendid in Ukraine even before. But the foreign farmers, I haven't heard that they are withdrawing the capital or their investment from Ukraine. At least I haven't heard. Even reverse, I do have cases where foreign farmers, they were even more sort of determined to help up to the country and to support with foods, with fuel, with tractors, and with the machines. So I don't have information. Let's put it that way. That they are withdrawing from Ukraine because in Ukraine there is a mood that this war, we will win the war, and why people shall leave the country. I mean, the farmers shall leave the country with their capital. So the war will be won anyway. Of course, I mean, this is the mood that we have in Ukraine. But there are of course individual cases, and yeah. That's what I can tell you about that.
Anyone else?
Yes, you talked about that the farmers receive a lower price in Ukraine, but I think you also talked about that food prices in Ukraine went up, and I think we had this discussion, last week, where we were talking about whether there's going to be even enough grain production for the Ukrainian people for next year. Could you maybe explain this issue a bit further, and maybe also with relation to the prices? Yeah,
I think that there will be enough grain available for domestic consumption because we produce way more than we need, and even with the current losses and damages that we have, we're still able to export this year, and there will be exports available next year, even at the expected level of output. This point number one, in terms of prices, they are quite low at the moment, but the prices for the food from the shelf, these prices are going up. Because although the raw material prices for grain are depressed, I mean, but that doesn't mean that the retail prices will decrease, because there are other components in the price setting available in Ukraine. So in that respect, we are not that different from the rest of the world. And you saw the map where Ukraine was particularly hurt by food prices. But what was interesting is that I didn't mention that in the presentation, but when the war outbroke, about 30% of retailers they shut down. So they terminated their operation, and in many places there was a, well, I wouldn't say shortage of food, but there were problems with the food supplies, because that was a really huge shock. Nobody knew what to do. Everybody was trying to adapt. But then, because of the the trade facilitation measures from the government side and from the European Union, and due to these negotiations that were taking place, the imports were coming in from the European Union, and then the retailers they resumed the operations. Of course, the variety of food is not that big as it was before the war, but still there is enough food in Ukraine. There are some places, like now in Kharkiv, for instance, people report really terrible things: no water, electricity, energy, and there is a shortage of food supplies there. But other than that, if you go to Kyiv, for instance, to Lviv, you don't have that problem with the food supplies.
Okay, because last week there was one of the questions was asked, and someone I think quoted Alexei Lizitsa, who was predicting that we might even see Ukraine in a net import situation next year. But you say that's maybe a bit too pessimistic?
I think it's too pessimistic. I mean, when it comes to import, I don't think that we will flip to the net import situation. There will be enough grain. We don't need that much of wheat, like 20 or 15 million tons of grain that we need. I mean, and this is, only the household farmers which are the small ones, they produce that much grain. You know, the Ukrainian agriculture is structured into a couple of groups, like we have large farmers operating up to 700,000 hectares of land. Then we have middle-sized farmers from 2 to 10,000 farms. And then we have a little bit smaller, but these are smallest, like 100 hectares, 150 hectares. And then we have the really small ones, having up to 3 hectares of land. And they also produce grain because of the liquidity problems, because of the difficulty to access. So I think, and they are less susceptible to this export, you know, alternative. So, you know, because of agricultural sector is so much diverse in terms of the producers, you know, I think that the risk of becoming importer of grain is really low. Is very low.
What is increasingly becoming clear is that the global supply situation next year might be worse than this year.
Yeah.
A lot of people thought after the war broke out that, you know, because of the problems in Ukraine, there was going to be a big shortage this year, but then next year would maybe be better. But at the moment, it looks like we got out of this year fairly well, actually, because the harvest was in the end rather good in the region,
yeah,
and everywhere else in the world. And now we're looking at considerably less production in Ukraine. And if we have any major problems anywhere else in the world, which, you know, we just can't predict right now, but if we have a major problem in North America or South America, then the global situation next year could actually be even worse, which is a scary prospect.
It's in the last report of the World Bank, and again, referring this commodity market outlook. So there was an interesting discussion that, you know, pricing are going down right now, but there are 3 factors that are acting against them. So the droughts across the world, so basically pessimistic outlook, you know, the likelihood of El Nino in next season, and the Russian war. And all the 3 factors are valid, basically, you know, and that means that it's really a bad feeling about the agricultural further agricultural prices and outlook.
Any other questions? There's one at the back.
So I have a question about the grain corridor, the agreement between Russia and the Ukraine. I do not understand why the Russians agree to it. What kind of benefits do they have from it?
I didn't get the question. Could you please speak up louder?
So what kind of benefits do the Russians have from the grain corridor agreement between the Ukraine and Russia? So if the Russians want to destroy Ukraine or the Ukraine farmers, why do they let them export their wheat?
So you ask about the benefits for Russians of this grain corridor, right?
Yes.
Okay, then I got it right. Yeah, it's a good question, really. We always have discussion what could be on the table or under the table of this deal. I myself don't have a clear answer to that. Why Russia sort of... there might be the case that, you know, there is a deal with Erdogan for something. You know, there's a political story behind that we are not aware of. Because again, from economical point of view, this grain corridor benefits the countries that import our grain, but it doesn't really benefit a lot Ukrainian farmers because they still don't get a good price. Okay, so they release the storages, but in terms of economic output, economic performance, it doesn't help them a lot. So, yeah, that's all I can answer.
Yeah, it is a puzzle, and I haven't heard any really good explanations either. One theory or one thing that I have read is that that Turkey, Erdogan, is playing a very important role in this and putting a lot of pressure on Russia. And Russia's grain exports at the moment also depend on Turkey, ultimately. And for that reason, when Russia announced, I guess about 2 weeks ago, that they were going to close the corridor, and 3 days later they reopened it, that in the background, Turkey especially played a very important role there. But that's just speculation, because economically speaking, you're right. I mean, it would make more sense for Russia to close down the corridor. Other questions? Yeah.
Yes. Today is opening the largest live food fair in the world, Eurotier in Hanover. You mentioned before poultry is a big important export item. I know you have big slaughterhouses of poultry meat in your country. Can you tell us a little bit, besides your grain export, what is the poultry part in the volume? And with these big, huge owners, I know, for example, today was a talk we are missing that was connected actually with the Saudi agricultural background. Is that correct? Who are these in the ownership? That would be interesting me in these big poultry operations. What kind of people are there behind?
Poultry is, this is an interesting case in terms of how it developed over the time in Ukraine. It's really concentrated sector in Ukraine. I think more than half of the sector belongs to to one agri-holding. So we have three, I think, major players in this sector. So MHP, then the other two I forgot, I don't remember. But this MHP is really has had, at least before the war, a huge share in the production, and eventually it was trying to expand, of course, and to abroad, because the feed is available, so the grain, and then the poultry production doesn't require really a long capital, so there is comparable to crop production, I would say. But now they also suffering a lot. I mean, I showed the figures that about 12 million of heads of chicken are killed, destroyed during the war. It's not that, it's about 5% of the total herd of poultry in Ukraine, but it's still it's quite a lot. And how they are trying to to negotiate with other export partners at the moment, I don't know. I don't have this information just to share with you. But yeah, poultry was has been one of the kind of success stories in Ukraine. Although the drivers were a little bit protectionists, because they experienced or they benefited a lot from protection, from the domestic protection, in terms of the import quotas, import tariffs, and domestic support. But they export and produce a lot in Ukraine.
Anyone else? If that's not the case, then I will close for today. I'd like to first thank you very, very much, Oleg, for coming today and for coming on such short notice and giving us such an in-depth view from a Ukrainian perspective on what's happening in your country. Thank you very, very much for that. And
I'd also like to thank Germany for for all the help that it provides to Ukraine in various kind of forms, in terms of receiving refugees, supplying lots of food, materials, and of course military support is also very much welcome, and thanks a lot for that.